before we kind of get into our excellent panel we have slated for today. Hello, Ravi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
How are you this morning?
Thank you.
Can you hear us, Ravi?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep. Loud and clear. Fantastic. All right. So we're live. So thank you so much for joining everyone today. My name is Jacob Brostman. I'm with the Public Spend Forum, a US-based firm that specializes in trying to open government markets. And we do this through artificial intelligence and our AI-enabled market intelligence program offering called GovShop. I was introduced to Kime, who is leading up this symposium, pretty recently, and I'm happy to serve as the moderator for today's discussion. So just to kind of kick things off and introduce our panelists, we have Elaine Bannerman with the Pan-African Tech Foundation. We have Ravi Srivasan, who's a partner at CivAmy and is an on the advisory board of the Blockchain for Social Impact. We have Desiree, who is with, I'm not sure I actually had Desiree on my list, but we can
Africa Blockchain Institute. And,
sorry?
Africa Blockchain Institute.
Africa
Rwanda Blockchain Rwanda Association.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you. And then we also have Nesh Jade, who's a partner at C-Lab, as well as John Karanja, who's the CEO and co-founder of Melanin Solar and is also associated with BitHub Africa. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This is really the second kind of main panel on the second week session for this larger symposium. And really what this week's panel is really focusing on is this idea of how blockchain is really able to aid infrastructure integration for future economic growth, global production, investment, and trade, and facilitating foreign direct investment, those types of concepts. And so the first question that we have for today that we can really discuss is the actions, and of course, we have a pretty large panel, and of course, an hour is something, we have 4 questions, but we could, I'm sure, stretch out each of these questions into an hour if we wanted to. But our first main question really focuses on the actions that are being undertaken so far by countries in order to build digital infrastructure needed to support the vision of a single market, and of course, the resulting trade and economic growth that results in that. And so what are ways that countries are taking action to build the digital economy, to build cloud computing infrastructure, to strengthen broadband infrastructure, to promote e-commerce, and to promote regional digital payments? That's, of course, a very broad and encompassing, set of concepts. But does anyone want to take it off for today and just discuss, what they know about the developments going on so far within this system? So,
if I can say something, I think the first thing is perhaps we want to look at the Africa Free Trade, Africa Continental Free Trade Area,
yeah,
which obviously would facilitate trade, intra-Africa trade between various countries. I think that is a super development for integration of trade within various countries in Africa. Now, coming to digital transformation, the African Union has, I understand, a policy which all governments would take on responsibility for digital transformation within their own countries. So the interesting thing is that how do we then come up with a kind of unified approach to digital transformation, an integrated approach to digital transformation within various countries and for various governments? How do they come together? I think they all come together within the auspices of the African Union. So the question is there a single a unified approach, which all governments are considering. I mean, to the extent that each African government is possibly looking at its own internal systems and its internal approaches to digital transformation, perhaps more from a public sector perspective, all the way into a private sector perspective. The question then becomes, how do we then achieve an integrated Pan-African approach to digital transformation? That's what I get from this particular point that you raised, Jay.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Elaine. Does anyone want to kind of take that and run with it, or?
Maybe I can just complement to what Elena said. I am not directly involved in the AFCTA, but I think as all African, I'm kind of looking forward to it becoming reality, because it's been a long journey. And as a Rwandan and Central African, we've been following the process quite for a while. What I would like, though, in this process, beyond the policy making and the more administrative part of things, is that if we look at what has been happening in the construction of the European Union and the Euro, for example, or even back in the days, I mean, following the American model, the fact is that there are a lot of lessons learned that we can get from it in terms of how to jointly come up with a unified base that will then, on the policy, on the financial side, that's one thing. On the supply chain logistics, so there are a bunch of different areas that need to be tackled all at once, and to think of why technology-wise, I'm advocating for blockchain technology, or just in a holistic manner, a new way of economics, is because we need to find comprehensive, collaborative way to work together to have, if not unite monetary system, at least some way to do transaction between countries in a cost-efficient, time-efficient manner, which currently is not the case. We have to think of how to keep some kind of ownership in the base of this system as well, because currently it's not the case either. And we also have to think of educating, deploying some, making the people, the African citizen, first buying in the process. Because if the decision making is from the bottom, the top to the bottom, and we don't involve the people who will be actually implementing the benefit of this new union system, we might be just repeating what has been done for decades now, which is do as we say, but does not really matter what you'll get from it, as long as it is written in the policy and the regulation and so on. We've got to break it down and trying to make it as human-centered as possible. I know it sounds easy to say it from my purely technological background, but I've been lucky to work also a bit in decision-making at institutional level, and I understood the complexity of what we're dealing in. And I would like us to take this opportunity of these very special times that we're living in as a way that what seems to be impossible before now seems to be realistic. And if it's about doing a big change, then let's try to make it big.
Awesome. Thank you, Desiree. Nesh, did you have something you want to?
Yeah, I just really I'm a huge fan of this concept of like a unified monetary system, especially like when you look at the ways that Western Europe has battled like the dominance of the United States after like the world wars, and combining all their resources under like the euro and bringing out like this economic advantage and not allowing themselves to be leveraged by like, the new established monetary standard of the United States dollar. I think there's a lot to be said about doing those same types of things between African countries or inside of African countries with digital currencies. The concerns that I have, yes, kind of echo Desiree and Elaine, is where when it comes from a top down, you're potentially allowing censorship and like structures that could actually just allow a community of autocrats to just now leverage the community without the help of the outside world. They can just now control, and the progress and the intermittent growth is now just under their thumb. And so I really hope to see not just the governments adopting either blockchain technology or these other emerging tech, but like the actual people themselves becoming educated and aware of what this could mean to change their lives. And a big push for that for me, and like what we do at Cello, is mobile first blockchain technology and allowing like these broadband solutions to exist, because they're drastically harder to restrict.
Great. Thank you. Ravi, did you have something you want to add? It seems something.
Sure. No, I think this is a very interesting conversation, just building on everything Elaine, Nash, and Desiree had shared. Obviously, last week I had the opportunity to share some thoughts on digital currencies and how we're seeing that being implemented in multiple areas, in Sweden, in China with the digital yuan, etc. And absolutely, there's certainly a concern in those cases about how much of this is being directed by a central bank, what access do they then have to everyone's transactions, and then what privacy constraints will be put in place. So that, I think, will continue to remain a challenge, but obviously the efficiencies of just transaction costs with digital currencies could absolutely make for certainly transactions between multiple distinct jurisdictions, especially in places like Africa, a lot more efficient, and thereby just allow people to be able to transact without intermediaries in a more efficient manner. Some other solutions that I think are interesting to look at elsewhere. So in India, which again has its own challenges around privacy from the Aadhaar card and the digital identity layer that was implemented several years ago, what they've implemented in terms of India Stack, which is really a set of APIs that were set up by a nonprofit, again, with the blessing of the government, but allows the public sector and businesses and the private sector to basically utilize a digital infrastructure layer that's been created. So you can leverage the Aadhaar layer for managing digital records, for managing records of payment transactions, for consent of specific information sets between individuals and between organizations by private sector firms who are then launching this for their own specific needs across a huge geography of multiple languages and multiple cultures and societies. So you might have a local education solution in one state that allows people to share some information about their children's status. You might have another local transactional situation for farmers in another location. So these solutions are being developed using an API layer that the government has put together. So again, that allows for kind of a more organic development from the private and startup sector, as opposed to what we were talking about earlier of the government trying to push something from the top down, which is both has its risks and has a certain layer of inefficiency. So in terms of what we've seen in Europe, I think everyone here is obviously familiar with what Estonia has been able to do over the last 10, 15 years in terms of building a whole e-Estonia solution, if they will, to address interoperability, security and safety, healthcare, e-governance, mobility services, everything through their overall platform. And again, the role I think the government played there is interesting in the sense that they've provided, if you will, that interoperability layer where people can then, organizations can then plug into that layer to get only the information they want from different information data sets that are available, and they've have a culture of privacy that's been built in. I actually think that while that's a wonderful solution for us to continue to look at as a benchmark, it was unique to a country of a couple million people where they've got very specific needs in a very narrow geography. It's hard to say how much of that can be leveraged for large, diverse countries and then across a large, diverse area like the African Union without making the relevant changes that just account for the culture and the environment and the privacy requirements of a much broader set of citizens.
Thank you. John, do you have anything that you'd like to add to this?
Yes, thank you. I think we've had some great points from the panel. The thing I'd like to add is, having worked in the cryptocurrency space in Africa for the past 7 years, this space is the first space where I've seen the young Africans from many countries come together and discuss and ideate around solutions in various forums, whether they be WhatsApp groups or social media. So there's great potential in sort of unleashing the sort of the energy that young Africans have, who are majority of the population on the continent. The other thing that I've observed is essentially you have with these tools the opportunity to create solutions in other market segments that have not been addressed. For example, my startup, Melanin Solar, is focused on the energy space, where we are allowing people to share energy and store energy using digital tokens. And this is something that previously was not possible without blockchain technology. So I think we have a unique opportunity to leverage these tools as young Africans to solve the key problems that we have. I think in terms of policy, Ravi just mentioned we have countries like Estonia, which are providing a global digital platform for identity. And my co-founder and I, because we come from different African countries, we decided to use that platform when we were creating Melanin Solar as sort of a platform that we could roll out across Africa and even beyond. So the whole world is going to be in competition in terms of identity, blockchain, digital currencies. Ravi just talked about the Chinese digital currency. So we're now truly living in a global village. And it's up to African sort of leaders to come up with policies where they take advantage of their own markets, so that others don't come and begin to own these markets. So I think that's one of the challenges we have, in that you have the Chinese competing with the dollar, competing with cryptocurrencies on African markets, and that will leave sort of us at a disadvantage in terms of policy.
Thank you so much, John. We're also joined by CS Macharia with IBM and the Innovation Center. He's an Innovation Center leader for East Africa. CS, do you want to come on camera? And assuming you've heard the conversation so far, would you like to provide your insight? Do we have you, CS? Oh. Okay, well, in that case, we can move on to the second question. And this is something that Elaine, you actually kicked us off kind of right with, and that's talking about the kind of the facilitation of cooperation between and among different countries for the development of digitized industry and trade. And so, what do you think are going to be the requirements going forward in order to facilitate that? And what is the work being done by investment banks and governments, and then the AFCFTA in order to drive that dynamic?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Now, the African Union, in its digital transformation strategy, had a 10-year plan between 2020 and 2030. And within this 10-year plan, it set up 6 pillars, 6 foundational pillars, which I'll just list: an enabling environment, policy and regulation, digital infrastructure, digital skills and human capacity, digital innovation, and entrepreneurship. So in terms of a coordinated approach between various African governments, these are the 6 pillars which I guess the African Union is hoping that they would build upon to lead Africa towards a unified digital transformation strategy. And looking at a digital transformation strategy, we have the 2 technologies which in blockchain and artificial intelligence, which hopefully should be able to lead us along the path of ensuring that perhaps the use cases in the line of, let's say, things like developing innovative solutions for agriculture, improved food security, healthcare, delivering safe drinking water, quality, accessible education, digital identification, which we've touched upon, digital solutions for voting in elections, banking the unbanked, efficient management of utilities, which we all know is a huge problem in many African countries, and also effective tax collection. Now, I know when we talk about tax collection, it's a huge problem. You know, many African countries don't have the right systems for tax collection, and with some of the other potential developments that I have mentioned, you know, I think that voting in elections again becomes a big issue for us in Africa. So this is what I have in mind. I'm trying to work along, you know, the structures and the strategy that the African Union itself has put in place for countries. So the question is, how do we achieve this coordinated approach? I know we've had a conversation about a top-down approach, but in speaking with some of the young African entrepreneurs who I work with, they are also looking at more of a bottom-up approach, because from their perspective, why can't we develop something from a public sector perspective, or maybe from the youth's perspective? And we all know that the youth is Africa's greatest asset. You know, it's Africa's greatest demographic dividend, and we need to be able to leverage the quality and the intellectual capital that we have in our youth. So a lot of them are talking about, why don't we look at more an approach, not necessarily a coordinated top-down approach, which is what the African Union is proposing, but also consider a bottom-up approach, which involves coming up with solutions amongst the youth, solutions amongst the grassroots, and being able to then approach government to encourage government to look at these solutions, and for government to start to think about how to use the youth that it has and leverage these solutions in creating a more coordinated digital transformation approach from a government-to-government perspective. But it's also important that governments can think about a common coordinated approach amongst them, especially since there has also been conversation about having a single African currency.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Elaine. Yep, Nash, feel free.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say on the efficiency of like utilities question. There's a point that Elaine was making. I think that's a huge part for me. I've been doing some work with some folks out of Lagos, and we were looking into, interestingly, with Nigeria, there's no regulation laws around a personal acquisition and sharing of energy, because there's an energy deficit that's so great for, I think, about 22 million people, just specifically in Lagos. And so one of the things we were looking at is incorporating smart contracts and blockchain technology for people who are running solar panels. And this is something that was really like led by the youth, and now the youth are being like asked questions, and their projects integrated and kind of incubated by the government and the local government especially. But one of the greatest things was watching people and utilize stuff like Ethereum so that they could freely share energy from solar panels that they'd harnessed, and honestly, we're just like rigged these incredible little like machines on top of their houses or things like that to then freely share energy between themselves and their neighbors. And so all of that wasn't really possible without like a smart contract being involved and like actively a trustless sharing system. And so the things that I see happening for like blockchain and like the evolution it takes is, if Bitcoin, for instance, is going to be a hard asset that everyone around the world kind of like starts to accept as a hard asset, and now Ethereum is rising relatively quickly, but one of the things that our ecosystem as blockchain engineers have to do is like successfully incorporate a way for us to move Bitcoin onto Ethereum because of like the easy access to hard capital being on a smart contract based system. So I was really inspired by a lot of the youth of Lagos and seeing how aggressively they were tackling that problem and just finding solutions that I would never have thought of.
Maybe can I just jump into what you just said? I would actually ask, how can we give light to these kind of initiatives? Because typically, maybe I misexplained myself, I am advocating for a bottom-top approach in the sense that the innovation, the technology, the entrepreneurship comes from the bottom. I've been working on both sides, entrepreneurship and a bit of decision-making. But the fact is that beside working on policy and strategy and project management for multiple years, I was not actively making a change at the grassroots level. So what I've been trying to do is to connect both the top and the bottom, knowing that, and that's the challenge that most governments in the world and most organizations are facing. The skills and the talent don't typically work for public service because private sector is simply providing more incentives. The grassroots movements, like the one you're presenting here, they leverage these technologies that if they were in Silicon Valley, they'll get billions of investments. I mean, it's amazing to see how cryptocurrencies like Dogecoins are getting so much traction when they've been creating as a joke. So I don't want to divert the discussion here, but since this is also about cryptocurrencies and so on, how do we, considering the challenges that we're facing on the African continent, provide this as a use case for all of these innovative people in Lagos, in Kigali, in Bangui, in Mali, whatever, you name it, Kenya and so on, to get their hands on it. We, decision makers, public, private sectors, people with connection and resources, provide them with the ground to go from the idea to the prototype and eventually the commercial solution. And I can foresee a future when innovative technologies won't be coming from Singapore to Africa or Europe to Africa or US to Africa, but kind of the other way around. We already see it with India. India went from where it was many decades ago or some years ago to now having being heading the three, I think, of the top 5 biggest companies in the world. And I can see that with that approach, it is not unlikely that using the challenges we're facing, for example, energy, blockchain for energy grids. Back in 2017, I just wrote a presentation pitched in Berlin about smart grids that leverage on blockchain and smart contracts to incentivize people to use renewable electricity and being rewarded on top of it. Back then, though, I didn't know much about blockchain development. I just knew the strategy that is behind. Now you're telling me about people in Nigeria who are really building it, but they lack the connection to actually go from prototype to an actual product, commercial solution. If they'll be met with the market in US, Europe, Asia, that are currently moving towards renewable energy, they are putting billions in this sector. The strategy is written, the policy making is done, the billions are saved. Then we'll be having made in Nigeria solution that'll be powering some of the most developed countries in the world, because we've got the problem working on the solution and there are bigger markets beyond our countries. So long story short, grassroots movements, bottom-up approach, innovation comes from the bottom. What we need to do is finding ways to connect the resources with those who can put it together. And just to conclude about Bitcoin and so on, I don't know. I mean, I've been kind of pondering at the moment, what is this going to be? Because honestly, the price that currently the currency is as is just way too high to bank the unbanked in the future. It's not going to happen. I mean, there is no way it's going to go down. It's going to keep on going up. But those going to make profit out of it are those who have that currency in their pockets. And it's kind of very small fraction. Beside that, if we have very strong influencers that I'm not going to name, who make the rates of the currency going up and down from one day to another, it's not helping either for mass adoption. There are some players that we're not mentioning much that are currently in Africa. One specifically, and I don't want to advertise any brand, but that has been working with the Ethiopian government. And I can foresee that this company is going to work also for other massive African companies in government. So while we're focusing on Ethereum and Bitcoin, we forget that in the near future, Africa is going to be the biggest continent in terms of population. And people who start doing business and working on African challenges are going to be the one who will basically be tomorrow's crypto solutions of adoption. So Ethereum is great, Bitcoin are great, they provide smart contract and so on. But at the end of the day, these competitors that I'm mentioning, he is also the co-founder of Ethereum. It's just that he's been kind of, he had a different business model, more for-profit approach. But interestingly, he decided to not go for the open source solution, but is working with the unbanked. There will be more competitors, but long story short, I think the story is not written yet.
Yeah, if I can add on this sort of energy narrative, the entire space is quite huge. We're talking about a $2 trillion market. And there's no reason, like Nesh and Disra are saying, that these markets should not be owned by Africans and the actual innovators who are innovating these solutions. So I think the challenge would be, how do we set up at the government level policies that enable these innovators to thrive in their own markets, instead of having to rely on going offshore and looking for foreign partners to leverage the ideas. The opportunities and the talent and the energies in Africa, and I think we'll sort of be vindicated very soon once we see more of these ideas coming into the market.
I don't know, can I jump in? Sorry, I come in a bit late, but I think there's my experience being in an innovation hub and dealing with some of these startup businesses that have been there. The rate of which opportunities or businesses that were coming into fruition was a very low rate. And the thing is that we can throw this amount of technology to these young entrepreneurs and everything, but they also need a lot of hand-holding and guidance, right? There's also a lot of over-focus on maybe just the financial perspective only, without actually opening it up to the breadths that can be there. The areas which even have had talks about in terms of even engaging various partners, even in the Architectural Association of Kenya, trying to see how blockchain can be an improvement of the whole application of trying to get a building done or getting your plans approved. And not only from the front end part of it, which is just the approval, even from the back end part, when supposedly if you get a fire or so, how is a fire engine going to even know how the whole building is rigged or sorry, how the whole building is set up. We have in my previous role, we also worked in delivery of drugs using blockchain to remove our counterfeits. We looked at perspectives of actually trying to help traceability within coffee, and also helping shorten the process of export of avocados out of Kenya and into various European countries. But my view is, and when you talk about infrastructure, right? I have about 6 things that I really want to focus on, and maybe I'd actually mention them. But there's a paper that we're actually writing around initially around a Pan-African digital ID system, right? How is it going to be developed and how it's going to work with blockchain? 2 is around deepening electrification and connectivity to some of these areas which really need some of the assistance that's required. Closer and cheaper connectivity plus access to cloud environments is an essential key thing, right? I think skills development, we just mentioned it, right? And there's also an aspect of a flexible regulation to foster innovation. We have regulation that's like one size fits all and stops any sort of movement going on, right? And then going back into those skills development, and it's looking up to set up support hubs, which I've just mentioned, regionally, even outside the main cities, right? For skilling in a variety of IT knowledge, both hard and soft, right? And I believe if we could be able to sort of do some of all of these things, and we'd be able to at least start having some traction down this path.
Thank you, CS. Ravi, do you want to cap us off for this question?
Sure. No, there's so many interesting points that have been covered. I think when we look at how different governments are trying to approach, well, given their general conservative nature about dealing with regulation. So sometimes what I know some places try to do, so again, in Estonia, they actually made specific changes to their legal structure to allow for these technology platforms and interoperability to become a core tenet of how information and data is actually managed. And so they built that in kind of from the ground up. So to some degree, there's an element of almost rebuilding your legal and regulatory structure, which is a challenge. So sometimes we also see kind of test environments being created. So you have kind of these unique lab cities. So there's one recently which has come up called Praxis City. They're raising money to build a city in the Mediterranean Sea, essentially, free of quote unquote US government or other government regulations, to build their own governance structure. And yes, they're even talking about using blockchain. They're talking about having data privacy as kind of a core tenet of how they build up, et cetera. So that's one extreme. I'm not saying we have to go build our own society and then go and live there, but can we build very isolated small test environments, lab environments? This is something I was looking at in some of the work I was doing at Civimi in Costa Rica. We were looking at a project called a small techno park in San Jose. So are there specific isolated projects we can build? And then, kind of echoing some of the broader points Desiree and others made, how do we also become effective, and I don't have an answer for this, at marketing and presenting this so it gets the global attention that you would see from what I just mentioned, from Praxis City, from NEOM in Saudi Arabia, from Estonia as a whole. So, or what people have done in terms of being able to market themselves, you'd almost need to build that as a separate practice, which I think many other places have been effective at because they've been able to attract capital as a result of that. And then what are some of the elements we can bring when we talk about the other technology areas that have intersected with blockchain to bring us where we are today? So we're talking about Internet of Things, the idea of putting sensors and helping us everywhere from the management of buildings to the management of crops and agriculture, et cetera. Cloud, we now have all the major cloud providers that have a lot of the core tools in place. They all have data centers, not in every single African country, but at least they have them in Africa in different locations. So that's a push that I think will continue to increase. And then obviously machine learning and artificial intelligence, which hopefully I really translate that a little bit more as kind of just the ability to manage large unstructured data sets and be able to make predictions and glean information out of that and synthesis out of that. So being able to leverage those capabilities to then more efficiently drive end results. And so one of the solutions that I'm seeing out there that kind of echoes some of the comments we just made is, Microsoft Azure is working with a whole series of different companies, including Accenture on the incubation side, but really a series of smaller supply partners like Lenovo and Arrow and WeWin, et cetera, to bring innovative digital transformation in the supply chain. One of my colleagues at Blockchain for Social Impact, which is through which I'm participating in this, presented this in a blog recently for really improving significant improvements when you have a multi-layered supply chain for traceability of inventory, for in transport and storage, for network participants really having access to financial and information flows at every step of the supply chain across the entire layer, and then having this distributed ledger where all this information is stored as opposed to separate silos in kind of the traditional SAP or Oracle driven supply chain. So it's really an ecosystem with that trustless layer for payments and settlements, which again, the goal is to reduce our transaction costs and bring that efficiency, which is the way we're going to get the attention of the rest of the world in terms of building a solution that leapfrogs above everything else, kind of, which is what M-Pesa did. That's why M-Pesa got that global brand. But then how do we build additional solutions like that that kind of leapfrog above what everyone else does?
Yeah, if I could echo that and also push back on like a small part of it. I think like, yeah, for us, it's at Cello, one of the biggest tenets that we saw was like, how do you create a condition of prosperity for everyone, you know? And what we saw in the continent of Africa is essentially a continent that had, like you're saying, leapfrogged past laptops and desktops, and then yet these blockchain solutions that were out there were all focused on laptops and desktops and running nodes and things like that. And so why we made a mobile first blockchain is because we were like, well, we shouldn't be punishing this population for leapfrogging past the necessity of this hardware. And kind of to Desiree's point, there are other people that are looking to get involved in the African community other than Ethereum. And I'll just say who you were meaning, and you were meaning ADA or Cardano. And without being able to run a smart contract on Cardano, I'm not sure what their plan is, but their big like draw there is like low fees. And so like how can you keep fees low? How can you actually scale this with the people that are actually going to use it? And for us, that became pretty obvious. It's like you run partial nodes on cell phones themselves, and then you can have access to feature phones through that network if you need. But when it comes to like creating this innovation, one of the things that I was kind of saddened by a few days ago is to realize that Microsoft is a giant corporation, and they have done a lot of things for a lot of communities around the world, but it looks like they are going to be shutting down their Azure projects, and that to me is actually kind of indicative of like this trend that happens in like Silicon Valley, where it is we come in and we have Silicon Valley people going into Africa or India, and they set up like these resources for these people, and then the second that it doesn't affect their bottom line in the positive way that they want, it's suddenly this resource is now being taken away and gone forever. So it's one of those things where the solutions themselves have to just be given as like a foundational technology. Like the cell phone itself runs the blockchain, and then now it's up to the local indigenous population to build the solutions that will last with them forever. And it's just a big draw that we're seeing at Cello is like, since we're mobile first, we're seeing solutions that can stick around for generations.
No, yes, you're absolutely right that dependence on any of these companies, and Azure is shutting down blockchain, but they're saying they're going to leverage consensus as quorum and all that. So we'll see how all that plays out, obviously. But the dependence on any outside companies is probably one of the biggest concerns that folks have. And like, oh, these companies are building these solutions. And so you're absolutely right about it's looking at the fundamental foundational layers and how do we build that expertise and the structure of those layers where we're building those solutions from that layer of resilience, as opposed to trying to just take a platform that a company's provided that may or may not last and may not be maintained over time. It could be shut down, it could not be maintained. It could evolve in a direction that is unhelpful. It could involve with what we see with the other tech majors, where the data sets are not necessarily under our control, which is probably the single biggest challenge. So that layer of analysis needs to continue, I think, absolutely, to be a principle by which we evaluate and build these solutions.
Awesome.
If I may, I just want to say one thing, Jake. I just feel that for Africa, we probably need to focus on what our indigenous solutions are, and not just indigenous solutions, but we also need to look to indigenous investors. We can't always look to government, but I mean, definitely government needs to look at what the youth is actually doing in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. Many young people in Africa are going into entrepreneurship because they come out of university and there are no jobs for them. So it's very important that the government puts in place systems that can support the innovations of these young people and also enable them to grow as entrepreneurs. Now, from the private sector as well, we have quite a few billionaires on the continent. And one of my biggest concerns is the lack of investors coming out of Africa. For example, I was recently speaking with a potential investor for one of the mentees that I work with in terms of funding. And one of his biggest concerns was, why aren't we able to find investors from the African continent? And it's not that we can't find them, they are there. It's so important that we now start to, call them out, call out our African billionaires, our African, high net worth individuals, to start to look at what we're doing on the continent, and for us to be able to come together, to work together as one, one Africa, one people, as opposed to always looking for Western solutions, Western support, Western partnerships. We don't need to have Western partnerships or Western solutions if we can create our own. There's a lot of intellectual capital in Africa, or there's a lot of intellectual capital with Africans, very, very bright Africans. We can create these things, we can develop these things. If what we need then is investment to take them forward. And I strongly believe that we can have the next unicorn coming out of Africa, but we need to do it for ourselves. We can't always be relying on partners from the West to come and do this for us. So in respect to the solutions, some of the solutions that we've discussed, some of the amazing solutions that I see coming out of the continent from the young people, we also look at how we can scale these solutions continent-wide, so that they're not just a Kenyan solution or a Zimbabwean solution or a South African solution, but they are African solutions. This is all, when we talk about having a coordinated approach, a unified approach, we need to think of each other as one. It's one continent. And yes, I'm very proud of the gentleman at Carano in Africa, because he's half Ethiopian. So I mean, he has that African connection, and I think that helps. I think that would help tremendously. I think other similar organizations may struggle a bit because as Africans, we need to insist that there is a strong African connection for anyone coming to do any work in Africa, because we don't want to fall back into the past the colonial situations which we've all had to face, which means that we've had assets that have been taken out of the continent, and we've not been able to use the assets that we have to grow and develop the continent as it should be. I mean, one thing I just want to add before I close is that the African Union's intention or the plan of having this Africa, the Continental Free Trade Area, the main aim was to create a single market, which was expected to generate a combined GDP of more than $3.4 trillion to benefit all the peoples on the continent. I think that the African Union needs to not lose sight of this goal and this agenda, because when you have a goal and you have a plan, you have to work towards it. And the more times you look at your goal, the more times you wake up in the morning, you've got it plastered on your mirror, and you think about it, the more chances of you making sure that you can actually achieve your goal, or you can bring together the right solutions to achieve your goal. So we definitely need to look from a country to country perspective, and we also need to look at this from a unified perspective. And I think what I was trying to say here is that we need to look at how to scale up these amazing solutions we have across the continent.
Absolutely. Elaine, that actually is going to lead perfectly into kind of our next major topic. And of course, if anyone has anything they'd like to add on top of the current conversation, I think this next question is a great time to do it. But, given that we've been talking a bit earlier about all of these, regional development strategies and, the kind of larger scheme approaches, how do you really see data ownership, individual data ownership of individuals, communities playing a role in national digitization moving forward? And how is that something that, based off of the conversation that we've just been having, how do you think that that's something, this idea of individual data ownership is something that can drive, these dynamics like what Elaine was just mentioning?
If I could contribute and just possibly respond to, just complement what Elaine said. Maybe the challenge that we're having with the investors is that we're selling them a picture of 15,000 feet, right? And we are not coming down to try and give them the possibilities really down at the bottom, right? What I've mentioned to you is that there's that slow win rate or that follow-through rate where a lot of innovations are trying to be done, but they really don't have the right business case that they're resolving and solving. There needs to be that sort of intermarriage between what's actually coming out, what's actually happening in any vertical, and marrying it to, excuse me, to what technology can do, right? And getting viable business solutions coming out. Now, as you're saying, and going into your point, Jake, is that Africa has a lot of, especially even a lot of stories that are there of which people can even really attach to, that people can say that this is the data that I've created. There's a whole view of which a cultural perspective where people really want to understand more and deeper about their cultures. And we know everybody's around the diaspora, right? So assume you're talking about somebody in Adama or somewhere called Mandera, which is one of the remotest parts in Africa. An individual who's there most probably has cultural information and cultural content that they can be able to share across. How can we be able to capture it and register it and verify it and actually state that that's his data ownership that has been done? I'll give you a small story of somebody called Mohammed Amin, who was a journalist, who did a lot of media work in Africa. He passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. his son now is actually translated all his stuff into digital and is actually selling it on, right? So that opportunity of being able to use blockchain to actually enable and help that is really, really possible, right? I think it's just only having the right conversations and actually directing people in the right way to create the right solutions and seeing the viability, how people be able to get for not only funding, but being able to make it a way of making funds out of it. Yes.
Just quick comment about data ownership. I think before even talking about data ownership, we should look at what are the current data privacy and security policies that are in place in our continent. My profile hasn't been really disclosed and so on, but I worked both in private and government sector some years ago on Africa, the continent. And the fact is that I was quite amazed that we have such innovation there and very successful companies, homegrown, but also coming from US, straight from Silicon Valley. But what they find in the continent that they cannot find almost anywhere else is that there are very few limitations that are enforced in using people's data to power your solution. So if you're an AI company, African continent is great because you go there, you get people's data, you build your product, you make money on top of it. And even if the product is free for the customer, you know that you're actually, as a customer, is the product. So that's the part that I think we should first think of before thinking more complex thematics about data ownership on blockchain and so on. There is the one-on-one step we should need to do first. Quick reminder, I think also that we have to think of is that we talk about the computing, the cloud computing. As we all know, Web 3.0 is not going to put on cloud computing. Because if we put the future of the internet in the hands of 5 companies, which changed our life in many ways, and we all love them, but you also like not to like them. We know that blockchain solutions are doomed if they are put in the hands of a handful of companies. And despite the innovation coming out of it, the sci-funk movement that gave birth to Bitcoin and then gave birth to blockchain is not looking at putting the distributed solution that we hold for Africa on a handful of distributed data center, unless these companies also embrace the key features of blockchain, which is about censorship resistance, the strength of distributed computing, decentralization, all these concepts about data privacy and ownership that you're mentioning here, that currently Europe managed to come up with the GDPR. I've been advocating for years now that Africa as a continent adopts something that goes toward the GDPR. The US was reluctant, now it's getting there, thanks to the new administration, and also the fact that companies, whether they do it for themselves or not, look at Asia and Africa as a new market. And the fact is that you need to provide added security for your customers to feel comfortable using your solution. So for a purely business standpoint, it makes sense. About Estonia as an example, I would like maybe to promote an organization that I've been dealing and interacting with in Rwanda that got inspired by Estonia's model. And we have African examples, organizations, governments, public companies that also put all of your administrative information on internet, and you can pay it at the push of a button on your mobile phone or your feature phone, because that's another aspect that we tend to forget. Not everyone has a smartphone. Hopefully, at some point, the whole world will have a smartphone, but for those who cannot afford it, who are still using the very simple phone, most of them actually coming from China, because it is the only country that is still looking at customers who cannot afford a 1,000 euros cell phone. Then these people, big part of them being on my continent, needs to still have access to their birth certificate, to their ID paper. So we have African example. So I'm trying to advocate for homegrown solution that learned from the best example out there, but that adjusted it to local specification. And to complete, to not make it too complex, leave the space also to my colleagues out here. I've been trying to get private investments in the ventures that we've been running. I worked with innovators, entrepreneurs, trying to find funding that didn't come only from development partners. Because interestingly, what many developed countries don't know is that their countries are some of the biggest supports of my countries in terms of sustainable development, which is great, we need it, but they are filling a gap that the private sector is not getting in. Why? Reasons are many, but one that I've identified is that the cost of failure is very high, where I'm coming from. If you fail there, it's not just that you're gonna just go to the bank and say, I'm bankrupt, then they're gonna just erase all your bill. It's making your life collapsing. So the cost of failure is important. The coordination between private and public sector is not as seamless and frictionless as we'd like to be. So it makes that our billionaires on the continent do not yet do the additional step to invest in the youth because either they're blockage in many ways or they just didn't see the incentives. I pitched last time about game theory. I'm going to pitch again about it. What is the incentive for the players to change the status quo? We do not think enough about how do we incentivize the whole continent to get into AFCTA, which resulted in Nigeria waiting years before jumping into the AFCTA. How do we incentivize people to work together and to collaborate instead of competing? So that's just the last one.
Well, to that point, I think when you talk about the game theory aspect of it, and what's the incentive for people to change their behavior, you also, I think, are touching on something where you see people replicating the behavior they've seen before. So if you look at an instance where you have a continent of people whose data is yet to be like completely farmed and taken advantage of, you're going to see players come out of that continent that are willing to immediately create solutions to sell the data of those who are their indigenous like brothers and sisters. So you have people like the company of Jumia, for example, which I don't mean to like trash on Jumia, but it is a really big digital services company in Africa, and they claim that they're 100% African, 100% built by Africans. But in reality, they are a few on the ground Africans that are essentially creating the foundation for these services to be maintained by people who are expatriates of Europe, their technical team is based in Portugal. They have all their security people in Berlin and Germany, and they're really just selling the data of their communities to these outside influences. And we can say that like blockchain is going to impact this continent, and this blockchain is going to be a solution for the growth of the African continent. But in reality, it's one of those things where you're always going to have this population that isn't quite on the level and understanding the technologies the foundational technologies that are making their lifestyles work. And you're going to have people who do start to understand it and find ways to capitalize on the ignorance of those that are beneath them. So from the game theory perspective, one of the things that concerns me is, yes, we have these big investment players that are trying to capitalize and create opportunities for these young entrepreneurs. But if these young entrepreneurs don't take up the gauntlet of saying, okay, how can I do it differently? Not how can I make myself a pretty penny doing it the same way as others? We're going to run into the same problems. We're going to see more services like Jumia, which aren't actually 100% African built. It's just their branding and the way that they like lock in the interest and the data of these communities. And another thing is like you see organizations like the GSMA, which comes out with its like bond projections and its projections of this technological growth that get turned into like bond and investment projections for the next 20 to 30 years. And all of that ends up deciding the future of 1.3 billion people. So it is one of those things where I think that the education of what this technology actually does and how it impacts your life is potentially more important than even just like adopting it and using it to better people's life. I think the average citizens, like you're talking about, even those who are using the feature phones, should know about what is creating the value that they're using.
Yeah, and
right. And then I think what we've seen over the last 10
Rob,
years.
Yeah, feel free to go. I just wanted to give a time check because we're coming up on time. So
yeah, I know we're coming. So I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is exactly that. We've seen elements where personal data has been misused and then has been used for arguably nefarious purposes by parties leveraging information out of Facebook, et cetera. I mean, it wasn't just in the US election. We saw that, I think, happening in Africa as well. So there I think becomes an interesting case of how do you build a test bed where you can test this in an isolated manner, which is what we see for a lot of other projects. And then how do we measure those results where in an isolated, almost lab environment, and then scale based on that. And and then build regulations based on that. So there is that public-private sector collaboration we talked about is absolutely important, because the additional public sector guidelines and regulations that need to be set up need to take into account not just local data privacy and build on GDPR or anything else like that, but also what malicious actors from outside or others could choose to do, which will just, again, destroy trust in the entire system. And so I think it's a level of almost ongoing, persistent ability to build a regulatory framework that keeps on changing to support that.
Awesome. Thank you, Robbie. And with that, I think that pretty much brings us up to time, but I just want to thank everybody who participated in today's panel. It was a fantastic discussion. Of course, an hour is never enough time, especially with something as fascinating and interesting as blockchain and the implications it can have. So, but with that, I just want to thank everybody again. If there's anything else that comes up, I see regarding blockchain, I'll know who to reach out to. So, again, very enlightening discussion, and I think this will set a great stage for the future of the symposium. So, thank you all again. So, with that, I think we're all set to sign off. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So long, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for